In the summer of 1305, in the Tower of London's deepest chamber, a Scottish rebel named William Wallace endured something that English chroniclers would later describe with such disturbing detail that their accounts were suppressed for centuries. What King Edward I ordered done to Wallace wasn't execution. It was systematic sexual torture designed to destroy a man's body, mind, and dignity before crowds of thousands who had been specifically invited to witness the destruction. Wallace was already a broken man when they brought him to the wooden platform in Smithfield. He'd been captured after years of rebellion against English rule, transported to London in chains, subjected to a show trial where the verdict was predetermined. He knew he was going to die. What he didn't know was that Edward had spent weeks planning exactly how that death would happen, consulting with experts in prolonging suffering, designing a spectacle that would serve as eternal warning about what happened to men who challenged royal authority. The execution began with Wallace being stripped naked before the assembled crowd. But this wasn't simply removing clothes. The executioners worked slowly, cutting away each garment piece by piece, making Wallace stand exposed while thousands watched and jeered. Then came the castration. While Wallace was still fully conscious, still aware, the executioner cut off his genitals and held them up for the crowd to see before burning them in a brazier while Wallace watched. Only after that did the disembowelment begin. The executioner cutting open Wallace's abdomen and pulling out his intestines while he still lived. Wallace died badly, screaming, begging, reduced to animal sounds. Everything Edward wanted, because this wasn't about justice, or even about punishment. It was about using sexual violence to destroy the image of the warrior hero, to transform courage into humiliation, to make rebellion seem not noble, but pathetic. What you're about to discover comes from recently declassified medieval documents held in the British Library's restricted collections, from archaeological evidence found in torture chambers across Europe and Asia, and from accounts written by witnesses who couldn't unsee what they'd watched kings do to their enemies. This is the story of how absolute power created innovations in sexual torture, how kings competed to design the most psychologically destructive forms of sexual violence, and how these practices were deliberately hidden from history because they'd revealed too much about what monarchy actually meant. Throughout medieval and ancient history, kings and emperors understood that the most effective way to destroy an enemy wasn't simply to kill him. It was to unmake him, to strip away everything that made him human and masculine, to reduce him to something less than human before death finally came. Sexual torture served this purpose perfectly because it attacked not just the body, but identity, dignity, and the victim's image in society. Let me tell you about Vlad the Impaler, the 15th century ruler of Wallachia, whose reputation for cruelty was so extreme that he became the historical basis for Dracula. Popular culture knows Vlad for impalement, driving wooden stakes through victims' bodies. What popular culture doesn't discuss is that Vlad specifically designed his impalement methods to maximize sexual torture and humiliation. Standard impalement involved driving a stake through the victim's body from anus to mouth or shoulder, positioning the stake so that the victim's own weight would cause them to slide down gradually over hours or even days. But Vlad introduced refinements that made this worse. He ordered stakes carved with specific shapes, wider at the base and narrower at the tip, that would tear the rectum and internal organs in ways that maximized pain while avoiding immediate death. He positioned stakes at precise angles so victims would remain conscious longer. And he performed these impalements publicly, making sure entire populations witnessed what happened to anyone who challenged his authority. Historical records from the Saxon Chronicles describe forests of impaled victims outside Vlad's castle, bodies in various stages of dying, their positioning deliberately sexual to maximize humiliation. Women were impaled through the vagina, men through the anus. children through the abdomen. The sexual nature of the torture was intentional, designed to rob victims of dignity even in death. But Vlad went further. He would host feasts in these forests of dying victims, eating meals while surrounded by people screaming in agony. He forced captured enemies to watch their family members being impaled before they themselves were tortured. He ordered specific victims to be kept alive longer through careful stake positioning, so they could witness maximum suffering of others before their own deaths. Ottoman sources estimate that Vlad impaled over 20,000 people during his 6-year reign. Not all were enemies. Many were simply victims chosen to maintain the atmosphere of terror that kept his population submissive. The sexual nature of the torture served a purpose beyond the physical pain. It destroyed the victim's social identity, marking them as violated and humiliated, rather than as martyrs or heroes. Now let me tell you about Emperor Caligula of Rome, whose sexual tortures were so extreme that Roman historians, who weren't squeamish about violence, struggled to describe them fully. Caligula understood that for Roman men, whose entire identity centered on dominance and control, being sexually violated was considered worse than death. Caligula created a special torture chamber beneath the imperial palace where he would personally torture male prisoners, particularly those from noble families who had challenged his authority. The details come from accounts by historians Suetonius and Cassius Dio, who interviewed witnesses and survivors. The emperor would force male prisoners to perform sexual acts on each other while he watched and provided commentary. But this was just the beginning. He developed specific torture devices that violated victims sexually while causing extreme physical pain. One device involved a mechanical dildo made of bronze with internal spikes that would extend once inserted, causing internal lacerations that would lead to infection and death over days or weeks. Caligula didn't just torture enemies, he tortured their families, forcing fathers to watch sons being violated, forcing brothers to violate each other, creating layers of psychological destruction that extended beyond the immediate victim. Survivors reported that Caligula seemed to derive particular pleasure, not from the physical suffering, but from the psychological collapse, the moment when victims abandoned all dignity and begged for death. Archaeological excavations beneath the Palatine Hill in Rome in 2011 uncovered what researchers believe was Caligula's torture chamber. The room contained drainage systems suggesting significant amounts of bodily fluids needed to be removed regularly. Metal fragments found at the site matched descriptions of torture devices from ancient sources. Chemical analysis of material in the drains revealed biological residues consistent with sexual torture having occurred there. But perhaps no king explored sexual torture more systematically than Shaka Zulu, the 19th-century African king who transformed the Zulu kingdom through military innovation and absolute terror. Shaka understood that controlling sexuality gave him total power over his subjects, and he used sexual torture as both punishment and political tool. Shaka forbade his warriors from marrying or having sexual relations until they reached their late 30s, and he granted them permission. Breaking this rule meant execution, but not clean execution. Men caught having unauthorized sex would be subjected to torture specifically designed to destroy their genitals. The most common method involved crushing the testicles slowly using a wooden vise while the victim was held down by other warriors who were forced to watch and understand what would happen to them if they disobeyed. But Shaka's sexual tortures extended beyond his own warriors. When conquering enemy tribes, he would order mass castrations of captured men, creating populations of eunuchs who could never threaten his power through reproduction. Women from conquered tribes faced equally horrific treatment. Those deemed attractive would be taken into Shaka's harem, but acceptance into the harem meant submitting to sexual practices that British colonial sources described as torture disguised as intimacy. Shaka developed a punishment for women accused of adultery or disobedience that involved violation with sharpened wooden implements, causing internal injuries that would kill slowly over days. He would sometimes force the woman's husband or father to carry out this torture, ensuring maximum psychological destruction for everyone involved. Historical accounts from missionaries and traders who visited Shaka's court describe an atmosphere of sexual terror, where everyone, from highest nobles to lowest servants, lived in fear of sexual torture if they displeased the king. Shaka maintained control over a population of perhaps 250,000 people, partly through military force, but mostly through systematic sexual violence that made rebellion psychologically impossible. Let me tell you about the Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, whose creativity in sexual torture was so notorious that his own court eventually overthrew him. Justinian was particularly focused on using sexual torture against religious enemies, particularly those he considered heretics or pagans. Historical sources describe Justinian ordering the creation of a device called the Judas cradle, a pyramid-shaped seat onto which victims would be lowered anus first or vagina first, their own weight causing them to be penetrated by the pyramid point. The torture could be prolonged for days by raising and lowering the victim periodically, by adding weights to increase pressure, by making the pyramid point just dull enough to cause tearing without puncturing vital organs immediately. But Justinian added refinements. He would have the pyramid heated, causing burns in addition to penetration. He would have victims tied in positions where they couldn't adjust their weight, forcing them to experience continuous pressure. He would perform these tortures during religious festivals, framing sexual torture as punishment from God for heresy. Archaeological evidence from Byzantine torture chambers includes stone pyramids matching descriptions of the Judas cradle with staining and residue consistent with their described use. The devices show signs of repeated use over decades, suggesting this wasn't rare or exceptional, but was standard practice for religious persecution under Justinian. Now let me tell you about the Mongol Khans, particularly Genghis Khan and his successors, who understood sexual torture as warfare strategy. The Mongols were famous for military efficiency and brutality, but their use of sexual violence went beyond battlefield rape into systematic torture designed to break enemy societies psychologically. When Mongol armies conquered cities, particularly cities that had resisted rather than surrendering immediately, they would implement what they called the example. This involved gathering the population in central squares and then systematically sexually torturing and killing a percentage of the population while forcing everyone else to watch. Men would be castrated publicly. Women would be raped by multiple soldiers while their families watched. Children would be violated to destroy their parents psychologically. But the Mongols didn't just commit these acts randomly. They developed systems and protocols for maximum psychological impact. They would separate families and then reunite them specifically to force them to witness each other's torture. They would spare some family members, but torture others, creating survivors who would spread stories of what happened. They would film certain individuals, usually community leaders or respected elders, for the worst tortures to demonstrate that no one was protected by status or respect. Historical accounts describe Mongol commanders consulting with each other about which torture methods were most effective at breaking enemy morale. They shared techniques and innovations. They competed to develop new approaches. Sexual torture became a military science for the Mongols, studied and refined across decades of conquest. Chinese sources estimate that during the Mongol conquest of China alone, over 1 million people were subjected to some form of sexual torture as part of Mongol intimidation tactics. Persian sources describe similar numbers for the Mongol invasion of the Middle East. The Mongols understood that armies could be rebuilt, cities could be reconstructed, but populations that had been sexually tortured would remain broken for generations. Let me tell you about King Henry VIII of England, whose sexual tortures are less well known than his multiple marriages, but were equally calculated in their cruelty. Henry used sexual torture primarily against religious enemies, particularly Catholics who refused to acknowledge him as head of the English Church. The standard execution for traitors in Henry's England involved hanging, drawing, and quartering, which included castration while the victim was still alive. But Henry added personal touches. He would order executioners to make the castration extremely slow, cutting away tissue bit by bit rather than in one stroke. He would have victims' genitals displayed on London Bridge alongside their heads, marking them not just as traitors, but as sexually destroyed. For women who challenged his authority, particularly those accused of adultery against him like Anne Boleyn, Henry employed different tortures. While Anne herself was beheaded relatively quickly, women accused of lesser sexual offenses faced torture that involved violation with hot irons, insertion of rough objects, and other sexual punishments designed to destroy them internally. Tower of London records, recently digitized and made available to researchers, include inventories of torture devices from Henry's reign. These inventories list items described as woman's discipline tools and instruments of intimate correction, euphemisms for devices designed for sexual torture. Chemical analysis of residue on these devices confirms they were used for their intended horrible purposes. But perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated sexual torture system was developed by the Inquisition across multiple centuries and multiple countries. The Inquisition is famous for burning heretics, but that was actually the merciful ending. Before the burning came months or years of imprisonment and torture, much of it specifically sexual in nature. Inquisition torture manuals, preserved in Vatican archives and in Spanish national collections, describe procedures in clinical detail. For men suspected of heresy, torture could include crushing of the testicles using specialized devices, insertion of hot irons into the urethra, forced erection followed by damage to maintain the erection painfully. For women, torture included breast ripping using claws or hot pincers, vaginal insertion of rough objects or animals, and a device called the pear, which would be inserted vaginally or anally, and then expanded mechanically to cause internal tearing. These tortures weren't spontaneous cruelty. They were systematized in official documents, taught to inquisitors, refined over generations. The manuals explain the theological reasoning. Sexual torture was appropriate for heretics because heresy was a form of spiritual fornication, a violation of the Church's purity, and therefore should be punished through violation of the body's most intimate aspects. Inquisition records are remarkably detailed because inquisitors kept careful documentation. They recorded how long each torture session lasted, how the victim responded, whether confession was obtained, what additional tortures were planned. These records reveal that sexual torture was used not primarily to extract confessions, but to destroy the victim's sense of self, to make them see themselves as corrupted and violated, and therefore deserving of death. Archaeological evidence from Inquisition chambers across Spain and Portugal reveals rooms specifically designed for sexual torture, with restraint systems, drainage for bodily fluids, and residue patterns consistent with the tortures described in documents. This wasn't myth or propaganda. This was real, systematic, officially sanctioned sexual violence spanning centuries and destroying thousands of lives. Now, why am I telling you about all this horror? What's the point of documenting these nightmare practices from history? Because understanding how kings used sexual torture reveals something crucial about how absolute power operates and how societies normalize atrocities when they serve political purposes. Every king I've described believed he was justified. Edward thought Wallace deserved destruction for rebellion. Vlad thought impalement maintained order. Caligula thought sexual torture demonstrated his godlike status. Shaka thought sexual control prevented chaos. Justinian thought torturing heretics pleased God. The Mongols thought sexual violence was efficient warfare. Henry thought destroying sexual traitors protected his authority. The Inquisition thought sexual torture saved souls. They all had justifications. They all had frameworks that made their actions seem reasonable within their worldview. They all had supporters who agreed that these tortures were necessary or appropriate, or at least acceptable costs for maintaining stability. And here's the disturbing part. These practices were often popular. Crowds gathered to watch executions involving sexual torture. They cheered when victims were sexually destroyed. They understood these spectacles as entertainment and as reassuring demonstrations that authority was being maintained and enemies were being punished. The capacity for sexual torture isn't unique to medieval or ancient societies. The 20th century saw systematic sexual torture in Nazi concentration camps, in Stalin's gulags, in Japanese prisoner of war camps, in countless other contexts where absolute power encountered the powerless. The 21st century has documented sexual torture in Abu Ghraib, in Syria, in Myanmar, in contexts where authorities convince themselves that extreme measures are justified. The common thread is that sexual torture serves power by destroying not just bodies but identities, by making victims understand themselves as violated and therefore less than human, by creating spectacles that terrify populations into submission. Kings throughout history understood this instinctively and built systems to exploit it. If this history has disturbed you, if you're shocked by how systematically kings developed sexual torture as a political tool, then subscribe to this channel because the history books sanitize these realities and present monarchy as noble rather than not as the horror show it actually was. Drop a comment telling me which king's torture methods shocked you most. Was it Vlad's impalement forests? Caligula's personal torture chamber? Shaka's sexual control systems? Shaka's sexual control systems? The Inquisition's systematized violation. Your engagement helps spread awareness of historical realities that powerful institutions still try to suppress. And remember this. The kings who created these tortures were celebrated in their time. They were called great, strong, divinely appointed. Their crimes were framed as justice, their cruelty as necessity, their sexual torture as appropriate punishment. Only centuries later, after their power ended, did historians begin to document the reality of what they'd done. That should make us question what current authorities are doing that future historians will look back on with horror. What practices that seem normal or justified now will be seen as atrocities later? What forms of power are we normalizing that operate through similar dynamics of sexual control, humiliation, and destruction of identity? Until next time, keep questioning whether the powerful deserve the authority they claim, and whether the violence they commit in the name of order or justice or security is actually about maintaining their own power. The truth is always darker than official histories admit, and the kings we're taught to respect were often monsters whose victims had no voice to tell their stories until centuries after they died.